Cedric doesn't need much more of an introduction. So with that, Cedric, carry on.
Excellent, thanks, Ray, and thanks for the invitation. Great to be part of this. It is unfortunate that we're not able to get together, which will become evident, I think, as we walk through this presentation. The importance of co-development and how we're going to seek to do this work over the coming months and years. So we've got an hour. So I took the liberty to extend the conversation a little bit, Ray, into more into some of the carbon offset programs and some greenhouse gas mitigation programs that we're seeing coming down the pipe. You and Zosha are the top that I'm seeing here on my screen. So if there are things that you want me to elaborate on, wave your hand or raise a hand, and I'll keep an eye on that as we go. I don't want to speak for an hour. I'd like to do some intros. I'd like to get some feedback on this if we can, maybe have some questions and a little bit of back and forth. So project goals. So the idea of the Living Lab, that actually started about 4 years ago, and the Living Lab in Prince Edward Island was the very first in Canada. Then that expanded out to Ontario. There's one in Eastern Manitoba and one in Quebec as well. The initial focus of those Living Labs was on water and soil quality, and kind of the interaction between the soil-water interface. So Ag Canada has invested significantly, about $85 million to build a Living Lab network across the country. And so we are, New Brunswick as part of that, as is Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And the focus of these Living Labs is clearly on greenhouse gas mitigation and increasing carbon sequestration. So the whole idea behind this is to support knowledge translation and transfer of BMPs, again, that increase soil carbon sequestration or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the focus of this Living Lab initially is largely on nitrous oxide. Methane doesn't factor in so much to this project, but I think based on what came out of COP26 and some newly announced methane strategies globally, methane is going to become a much more important component of what we do moving forward. But it doesn't stop there. We're looking at other, what we call ecological goods and service variables. So water quality, biodiversity, and soil conservation are included there, but that's not an exclusive list. So it really comes down to how is agriculture working within the larger landscape to bring positive benefits throughout and minimizing any negative impacts we may have. So the Living Lab model is about integrating science with extension, essentially. So you can see that number 2 goal there is to get Ag Canada scientists out onto the landscape. So we're moving largely from a small plot, kind of largely replicated type of research. Not to say that is going to go away, but that's not all we're going to be looking at in terms of research. We're going to be doing commercial scale research. And so that allows us to explore research ideas and hypothesis within a commercial setting. And so, we've come, I think a lot of public and private entities have come to the recognition that the way we've done science in the past hasn't promoted practice adoption largely. It's not been as effective as maybe we need it to be. So moving away from doing science for the sake of science to doing science to drive specific program and policy goals is largely where this path is taking us. So that's where you're seeing that integration of the knowledge and translation and transfer strategy with the science, to make sure that we're hitting all those goals simultaneously. Makes it big, makes it complex, makes it somewhat difficult, and it is new. But we're walking our way through it. The third piece here, and it's not really a project goal for the New Brunswick Ag Climate Solutions, the NB-ACS, but it is part of the larger package that we're going to see in how programs and policies are rolling out at Ag Canada, and then how that dovetails through the next policy framework, which I'll discuss later. So I just want to take a moment and recognize there's about 25 collaborators on this list. and the idea of the Living Lab is certainly co-development with primary producers to set the science agenda, to set the extension agenda, and because ultimately the key performance indicators for the NB-ACS, the KPIs, is practice adoption. How many acres, how many farmers have adopted a BMP? So again, it's not just putting on a field day. How many growers came out to the field day? How many fact sheets were generated? How many presentations were given? It's about how many growers have adopted, how many BMPs, and how many acres did they apply it to? Because when you count up the acres and you apply your greenhouse gas coefficients to a best management practice, you get tons of carbon. And I'll go through that a little bit later, how that's calculated. But the collaborators here, again, is a recognition of the diversity of the New Brunswick agriculture sector. And each one of these groups has a membership base that they can reach, and they have committed to reaching. And that's how we're going to achieve, a large, effective, consistent KTT strategy. So hats off to all the collaborators and for coming to the table with the co-development mindset. It was tough to get going. It was a new approach, but once we did get moving, things have flowed really quite well. And I'll look forward to Ray and Zosha's comments. And I don't know if Dave Walker's on. Dave's been an integral part of this as well. So again, hats off to all the collaborators, and New Brunswick Soil and Crop has been certainly core to that effort. So thanks for that leadership as well. So KTT, taking this right from the University of Guelph, and they've got some really, really great documents there to outline what KTT is and why it rolls. And so you can read through that there, but it really speaks to integrating researchers and end users. And making sure that the research is very relevant to the needs of the time and the needs of the space. Right now, obviously, we're all kind of grappling with climate change adaptation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is increasingly coming under fire for its contribution to climate change, and so this integration becomes really critical as we identify the most important research questions to be answered of the day. And again, moving away from, science for the sake of science, because, that's what we do, to science for the sake of program and policy development and support. So I've got the link down there, really, really nice little guide to KTT. If anybody's interested, I'll be sharing this presentation with Zosha later. And I assume it can be shared, but that's if you just Google University of Guelph KTT or knowledge and translation and transfer strategy, this document will pop up. And it's something that we've used to help inform the KTT strategy for the NB-ACS. All right, so on-farm adoption support, that's the name of the game here, is getting more BMPs on more acres with more growers. I will note this is we've scoped this as a 5-year project. It's about $4.5 million over 5 years. 30% of that is going directly to Ag Canada researchers. So it's about a $3.1 million shot to the New Brunswick Ag sector over 5 years. So we're going to be focusing on 7 areas, and I'm going to walk you through these a little bit right now, so I won't labor this list too much. All right, so first focus area, strategic crop rotations and management system. So, I mean, this plays exceptionally well to the work, and the majority of these really do play exceptionally well to the work that New Brunswick Soil and Crop is doing. We've always had a very clear focus on no-till, good crop rotations, good use of perennials, all of those things come up. So ultimately what we're trying to do is increase our soil health and organic matter levels. And we largely do that through good rotations, cover crops, perennial crops, but it really comes down to minimizing steel. When we grow crops and then we put steel to the soil, we put that organic matter back into the atmosphere as CO2. So wherever possible, we need to minimize our use of tillage, bottom line. Then there's all kinds of other things that we can look to with, increased legume content, big tap roots, the cover crops, all those pieces. But it really largely comes down to tillage when it comes to carbon sequestration. Do we have a great big opportunity to drive carbon into our soils? I can hear Keira Miller now. Keira, I suspect there's a question going to be coming on this. You're right, it's a challenge. And when you look at the map of New Brunswick, where our carbon stocks currently reside, they are largely within the Sussex area, central, around the Fredericton area, and down south in the Tantramar region. What's consistent in those areas is grasses, is a dairy and beef sector, and lots of pasture, lots of perennial forage. That's where the carbon stocks currently reside. You get up into the valley where I'm sitting here now, intensive potato production, not a lot, not as much there, right? Is there opportunity? Yes. Is it small and incremental? You bet. Do we need to be looking at this long-term? Absolutely. That is critical. We do not typically see, no, we don't, I'm going to take that out. We do not see rapid increases in organic matter, typically anywhere. It's a long, slow process, and we need to look at, adoption over the long term. There are no flash in the pan opportunities. And I know that's counter to, some of the Gabe Brown type mentalities. I'm just going to throw it right out there. I really struggle with that concept. In the majority of cases, a 1% organic matter increase takes probably 10 years to get, and it doesn't happen in a year or two. If it did, then our entire soil classification system in Western Canada would change. Second focus area is cover crop integration. And so this is living roots year round, keep your soils covered. You've heard these catchphrases before. The longer we keep a crop growing and roots, generating, we get carbon, we get globulins, we get all the good things that happen from a soil health perspective. But I think probably more importantly within our context here in Eastern Canada is nitrogen. So a big part of our nitrous oxide emissions come when we have residual fall nitrogen sitting out, right? So 2 years ago, we fertilized for 155 bushel corn. We had a drought. We only got 135. We had 15 to 18 pounds of nitrogen sitting out in the fall. Nobody's fault. We had a drought, but it was still there. A cover crop will sequester that nitrogen in a biological form, in organic matter, and hold it. If we don't hold it, it stays free in the soil. And when it's free, it's available to denitrification bacteria, which drive it out as nitrous oxide, right? Very complex process, biological process. Makes agriculture really tough to deal with on greenhouse gas. But we can put together simple, more simple BMPs to get the job done. Now, I know the question that's going to come, and it's rolling around in everybody's head. Well, look, Cedric, we already have a short growing season. How are we going to get cover crops established? This is not Illinois. I got it. We've heard that before. So we need to be thinking outside the box on cover crops. Establishing them after our commercial crops are done is not going to get the results that we need. We need to be thinking about intercropping, relay cropping, right? Dropping in Italian ryegrass within a growing corn crop when we top dress nitrogen, or broadcasting fall cereal rye in our potato crop in August before we dig, right? And then letting those seedlings come, and then they regenerate after the harvest operation is done. So it's that's again, that's the whole idea of the Living Lab, is to get some of those things out there, demonstrated, proven, and get through some of the agronomy challenges that we might face. So the next couple here, enhanced forage and pasture management, that's a focus. I mentioned it before. A lot of our carbon stocks are sitting within our grasslands in New Brunswick. So we want to preserve those and enhance those wherever possible. So again, all things here that soil and crop would typically be working on, depending on the region. But generally, when we increase our above ground biomass, we are increasing our soil carbon accumulation, right? So rotationally grazed pasture, for example, or a 3 or 4, no, let's not use that one yet. A 4 cut alfalfa system versus a 1 cut hay system, right? We're getting lots of alfalfa growth above ground, which means we're getting the same growth below ground in those roots. And every time we cut the alfalfa plant, those roots prune, then they regrow. So that in itself is carbon accumulation. If we only take 1 cut of hay per year, and then say it's a predominantly Timothy crop, right? Take 1 cut, we don't get a lot of regrowth. That means we're getting minimal carbon accumulation down below. So we need to be thinking about how we can advance the production of that forage to benefit both above and below ground outputs. Legume content is going to be a key piece of that. And that also goes to nitrogen management. The more legumes we can have in our system, the less nitrogen we need to be applying. So our target would be to maintain legume content of at least 50% in all of our grasslands to basically eliminate our need for supplemental nitrogen fertilizer. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Soil pH comes into the equation here from a couple levels. Of course, productivity of those grasslands, but also the efficiency of nitrogen use. And I think Ray had done some work here about a month ago and said that increasing pH from 6 to 6.5 gave us a 6% increase in nitrogen use efficiency. So Ray, I'll put you on the spot a little bit later to make sure I got those numbers right. So the pasture management goes along with forage. So we're looking at those grazing systems again, locking up our pastures a little bit, doing some rotational grazing, increasing above ground biomass and below ground biomass. And as I mentioned earlier, methane isn't a big piece of this Living Lab just yet. But when we increase the quality of our pastures and that dry matter intake to our ruminant livestock, we are driving down in enteric methane fermentation as well. So we need to be thinking about this from a systems-based approach, right? And all those things are going to start to play. So just to note, largely, to the beef sector here, that would be grazing in New Brunswick. We're going to have a piece in there to tackle that. And again, you see the legume content of those pastures, probably looking primarily at a white clover type of product that will give us season-long production of nitrogen and of forage, and grows in low pH environments, which would dominate a lot of our pasture systems. All right, so we're moving into fertility next, and I can't talk fertility without talking chemistry, and chemistry is largely pH. And so won't labor this a whole lot, but you can see where the green bars are, and that's pH 6, right? So the closer we get to pH 6.5, the better nutrient cycling we're going to get. So just contrast those red bars to the green ones, you know, and go to the fourth set of bars here in the overall. We go from a pH 4.5, you know, our fertilizer use efficiency is, you know, under 30%. Now, do we have a lot of 4.5 soils? Not necessarily. Do our blueberry growers work in that environment? Yes, they do. But you know, fresh soils that have been freshly cleared, you know, can they be in that zone? You bet. Now, I will say I did see an actively managed field soil test come in at 4.9 not so long ago. And this was from an area of high performance capacity. pH is 4.9, right? So there are pockets out there where we're managing soils within a very, very unfavorable environment for nutrient cycling. But also remember that in low pH soils, not only are we minimizing our nitrogen use efficiency, but our microbial activity is also minimized. So if the bugs can't do their work because they're sitting in a sour environment, we're not going to get the carbon accumulation that we need, or the biological nitrogen activity, or you know, our legumes aren't going to be able to generate nitrogen. So pH really does become a foundational driver to all these factors. Fourth focus area, soil fertility for our nutrient management becomes critical to this. So we are working with Fertilizers Canada. We know that the Maritimes is the only region that does not currently have a 4R training and development program. We need to change that. And the 4R principles really are a nice bundle of practices you can put together specific to an individual farm to drive a nutrient management program. So that's why that's top of the list there. But really what it comes down to, folks, is maximizing the efficient use of nitrogen. So we're looking at top dressing, split applications, product, you know, coated type products. There's all kinds of opportunities in that space where we're driving efficiency. Urease inhibitors on urea, another one to look at, especially in our grasslands. You know, if we're predominantly a grass-based system and we need to apply supplemental nitrogen, we really need to be looking hard at the use of those urease inhibitors, so we're not losing that nitrogen through volatilization. So the fifth focus area, a little bit peripheral, but I think at the end, I've got a few slides at the end that kind of outline why it's becoming much, much less peripheral. When we look at our landscapes, those areas that would be, well, there's your list, riparian zones, grasslands, forest boundaries, shelter belts, or fence, or you know, fence lines. Line fences, I guess. I was just searching for the term. Those are all very high, very carbon dense habitat features that exist on our landscapes, right? So they're becoming increasingly viewed as little treasures across these landscapes that need to be preserved because we're preserving the carbon within. As well, they provide habitat for species at risk, for pollinators, for non-species at risk. They are an active management or an active habitat for all these critters that are running around. And if you take a hard look at, you know, some of the research that's been done across the country, we saw Sam Robinson give his presentation last Friday on the work they've done to look at pollinator function across the landscape, and they're seeing increased yields along these carbon-rich environments. So there's a real interplay there between both conservation and biodiversity and habitat preservation and crop productivity that we need to explore. So this is where a lot of our stakeholder partners like Canadian Forage Sector, Water Restoration Committee, the Wolastoqey Nation in New Brunswick Environmental Network, Nature NB. Those groups are looking at these opportunities to work with agriculture to preserve and enhance these carbon-rich environments. So the sixth bucket, I guess, on the list, we can't talk about BMP adoption without exploring the financial implications of said BMP. So that is really a core piece of the NB-ACS, is understanding cost of production and the cost benefit, the return on investment from BMP adoption. So one thing we know is that we've got some BMPs on the list that already are net positive return to the farm. So taking a look at those to say, okay, why are they not being adopted now? Is it a policy issue? Is it a time issue? Is it a labor issue? Is it an equipment issue? We know that there's net positive return to be had. So there's something that's blocking its adoption besides the cost. Other BMPs, we know there's going to be additional cost to the farm. And so we'll explore those, understand what they are, and that allows us to better define program and policy vehicles that can help to overcome that adoption. If we know that we need more carbon in the soil and reduce nitrous oxide to meet our Paris targets going out to 2030, then we need to be looking at all the barriers in between for driving that BMP adoption. And that's really where this focus area comes in. So rest assured, we're not going to be coming in empty-handed with these BMP ideas, but having a very, very clear focus on financial implications. So there is a seventh one, and it's it kind of goes to this. So what comes next? And it's about long-term infrastructure. And as we walk our way through this, I'm just going to walk through this quickly for what comes next, because it goes to focus area number 7. So as we get, maybe more extended periods of drought, if we get more extended periods of wet weather, if that wet weather comes in very short cycles, i.e. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 inches of rain in a day, like we've seen increasingly across the country, are we prepared for that? And so this really moves us from a mindset of greenhouse gas mitigation to adaptation. And that's really focus area number 7, is taking a long-term view about where we need to go in the New Brunswick and Canadian agricultural context to deal with climate change and its impacts. So the Climate Accord, I've mentioned that, a few moments ago, but the Government of Canada has joined with the international community and committing itself to significant greenhouse gas targets. And that's why we're seeing, a clear focus of the Living Labs models on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. But as I'll mention a little bit later, other programs coming. So one thing that has shifted is agriculture is no longer exempt. And, in the greenhouse gas game for almost 20 years now, and when we first started, agriculture got a pass, right? So we're not going to impact our ability to feed ourselves through greenhouse gas policy. So, and we always said, we're 10% of the problem and 20% of the solution. That's where the carbon sequestration comes into play. And right now we're sitting at in that 8 to 9 to 10% of Canada's total emissions. However, everybody is being asked to make a contribution. And it really is the aggregate of lots of small actions that create climate action. And so the days of pointing at, the fossil fuel sector or the energy sector or whatever, manufacturing, and saying, oh, they're a lot bigger, we don't have to do it, they need to do it, those days are gone. Everybody needs to hitch the wagon and make the small contribution towards the larger goal. Help is being offered. I think that's the carrot and the stick here, right? Lots of help is being offered. So we've got the ACS, which we're talking about now, which is going to support BMP adoption on the farm. You've got the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, which I'll mention a little bit later. You've got the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund through Environment Climate Change Canada. There's lots of resources available to drive this change. Our challenge is making sure that people, again, hitch their wagon. So the next policy framework, right, that's rolling out 2023 to 2028. The Guelph statement that was put out by Minister Bibeau and all of her provincial counterparts, very clearly focused on ag for the next generation, cropping system resilience, risk management, environmental sustainability. So I think very, very, very clear, and we're going to see that in the next policy framework, that the programs and policies that are rolling out are very focused on that sustainability measure, and it all bundles into risk management. And so in my mind, this is a really clear shift, the start of a shift from greenhouse gas mitigation to climate change adaptation. And I've been in the mitigation world for, let's say, almost 20 years, really working on trying to drive those greenhouse gas emissions down. My personal focus, and I think a lot of the program policy focus, is turning to adaptation. Because I think there's a larger recognition that we're not going to slow this thing down. And the weather events of the last couple of years, I think, have clearly pointed to an angry and volatile climate. And agriculture is on the front lines of that change. So we need to be thinking about how we can adapt to deal with prolonged periods of drought, prolonged periods of wet, and lots of variations in between. And I think the Guelph statement, if you read between the lines, read the tea leaves, that's clearly what it's stating. So here's an opportunity on what comes next, the On-Farm Climate Action Fund. So this is a $200 million funding announcement announced by Minister Bibeau just before the last federal election. Notionally, there's about $21 million that is going to flow into the Maritimes. So just doing a little bit of back of the napkin math, that's $6 million for New Brunswick. Direct investment from Ottawa in climate smart BMPs. Challenge is that it's going to be spent in 2 years. And that's going to start in April 2022. So that's going to be a pretty big challenge. And back to the Guelph statement and some of the challenges we have largely with trying to drive innovation in New Brunswick, only 37% of growers actually know that we have a CAP program. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of comment, a lot of conjecture about, well, there's no programs available. There's no help for me. There's no funding there for me to access. Well, that certainly is not the case. We have got a fundamental blockage in reaching the primary producer community, maybe not members of New Brunswick Soil and Crop. And again, I commend the work that the group does in reaching the growers, but the rest of the growers that don't know that these programs exist, somehow we need to reach them, because again, we got $6 million or $3 million a year that needs to be launched for within these 3 BMP management areas. Now you may say, okay, that makes sense. We just saw them in the New Brunswick Agriculture Climate Solutions package. Yes, you did. Nitrogen management, cover cropping, grazing management. Those are the 3 primary BMPs that the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, OFCAF, is going to be supporting. So we need to be watching out for that, and we need to prepare ourselves as a collective for trying to drive this money out, because I think the risk is that if we don't do a good job of getting this money out on farm and getting practice change, getting some active practice change, then these kinds of funding opportunities may not materialize in the future, because the feds will say, look, if it was there, you couldn't deliver, we're going to have to look at a different way of doing it. So I know that New Brunswick Soil and Crop has got an application in for the OFCAF for delivery. So we should be hearing back from those programs in the next week or so. Quickly through some carbon offset programs. You know, there's lots of talk about this. I was blowing snow, got a call from a producer in Quebec who is meeting with Minister Bibeau tomorrow, asking about this. Like, how do we tackle this education program around carbon offsets? Well, it's a good question, and it really is an all hands on deck kind of scenario here. So you look at the Canadian offset system, it's being developed. There's a few packages in there for agriculture. So the soil carbon enrichment was the first one. They're looking at developing a livestock feedings protocol and manure management. It's largely around compost at this point, but I think if you look at biogas systems and renewable energy systems, that will ultimately be part of the Canadian offset system. Is it a great opportunity for New Brunswick growers? No, I don't think so. Our contribution to that is small and incremental again, and it takes a lot of people coming together in an aggregated fashion to take advantage of a regulated carbon offset trading system. Does that mean we can't get paid for our carbon? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that we need to probably look into some different mechanisms. That's for the voluntary market. At the bottom there, you can see lots of opportunities, the indigo ags, type of models. We've seen it in the past. I've seen all kinds of action in the US because the federal system there hasn't developed and really no leadership in the carbon offset program in the US. And that's where industry is taken on to drive through the voluntary market. Is it cloudy? Yes. Is it tricky? You bet. Is there money being flowed? Yes. How to deal with that and deal with your risk? It's the same as anything we do in agriculture. It all comes down to risk management, and we need to keep an eye on that. So, insetting. We've got offsetting, carbon offsets, right? Somebody pays you, takes the carbon, feeds it into their regulatory compliance system. Insetting, kind of like that, but it's really being driven by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And I encourage you to pop that into your Google browser, Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's there, sciencebasedtargets.org. It's a collection of international, multinational groups that have come together and say, all right, we need to reduce our emissions at the industry level because the lack of leadership at the government level consistently across the globe has put the ag industry in peril, quite honestly, because take a group like PepsiCo or Danone, right? They operate in many countries. And so to try and manage their regulatory risk with regards to greenhouse gas emissions becomes infinitely difficult. So industry said, okay, government's not going to lead, we will. They created the Science-Based Targets Initiative where everybody's reporting the same way. So see there at the bottom, right? You say, okay, well, that's okay. Well, it is okay as long as we have some clear leadership. And the challenge is with a group like McCain's or Danone standing up, say in The Hague and saying, we're going to reduce our emissions. We're going to be net zero by 2030. Maple Leaf, McCain's, Danone, PepsiCo, they were all there, right? They're making these claims. The challenge with that is from the grower community, 70 to 85% of greenhouse gas emissions along that food value chain are direct from the farm gate. Say that again, 70 to 85% of greenhouse gas emissions in the food that we eat comes directly from the farm gate. It's in primary production. So multinationals making international statements of sustainability, they're essentially saying it on your behalf, on the grower's behalf, the primary producer's behalf. And that's why this is a precarious situation for agriculture, is the entire globe has now said, all right, we're going net zero, which is where agriculture is increasingly being looked at saying, okay, guys, you've got to make your contribution. So is that a challenge? Yes. Is it an opportunity? You bet. Does it mean that we need to push our industry groups to invest in climate smart BMPs on the farm? Absolutely. Absolutely. Agriculture cannot be asked to do all this work without support. That's why you're seeing support coming from Minister Bibeau, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. You're seeing increasingly Environment Climate Change Canada investing in primary agriculture systems, largely on the grassland, in the grassland space. But we're going to have to be looking to industry, again, Canes, Danone, others, to make sure that they're investing at the farm gate as well. So can't have your cake and eat it too. So what comes next? I think, you know, to my comments around carbon offsets, my hope of agriculture carbon offset programs is lessened every day. Really takes a concerted effort from a lot of people doing the same thing, a lot of paperwork to move towards a regulated, to move carbon offsets into a regulated market. Again, does that mean we can't get paid for our carbon? No. That's where we're seeing the off-cap type programs. That's where you're seeing the in-setting programs that are likely going to see incentive from, you know, public and private partners at the farm level to adopt BMPs that have a positive greenhouse gas impact. So, is that the best of both worlds? In my mind, I think it makes sense. It's the financial investment that we need to drive some BMP adoption. Second one there, increased focus on biodiversity and habitat management. You know, we all, as primary producers here in New Brunswick, you know, we would all typically run some farmland and some forest land next to one another, right? So we you know, we're largely achieving some biodiversity and habitat management goals. Is that good enough? I'm afraid it's not going to be. Agriculture globally is recognized as the largest contributor to biodiversity and habitat loss of any sector. So that comes to bear, right? Is that really applicable largely for New Brunswick? Maybe not. We might be doing better than other areas of the country, say Western Canada, where they're, you know, plowing up, you know, millennia-old grasslands, you know, native prairie for wheat and canola production. Is that a challenge before them? Yes, it is. Does that impact on us? Yes, it does, because we are a Canadian agricultural sector. So not to say, well, just to put it on the table. It's an increased focus. It's also bringing additional dollars to the table for preservation. So we need to be looking at that. And that will be part of the Living Labs model to understand that last point there, which is landscape-based management programs. Looking at the landscape as a whole. How does our farmland border on the forest, borders on the brook, borders on the river, working across the landscape, across the watershed, to make sure that we're maximizing our both productivity, but minimizing our negative impact on the landscape around us. Last slide here. So how does it tie into the big picture, right? We're going to have 25 sites across the province looking at, you know, those 5 to 7 focus areas I mentioned earlier. Obviously going to have a big focus on nitrogen management, cover cropping, and grazing management systems over the next 2 years to the off-calf. We're also going to be integrating with regional partners. So that would be Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island Living Labs to make sure that we're aligning our efforts wherever possible and getting maximum efficiency. Again, that practice adoption is key. We're going to be tracking and reporting. We're going to be using satellite imagery wherever possible to collect that data necessary to understand practice adoption. That financial impact exploration will be really critical to be working with NB-DAF and as we roll into, you know, the next policy framework with the Guelph Statement of Mind, linking all of these things together to make sure that we're really aligning and designing programs and policy that maximize BMP adoption and sustainability across the sector. The science validation, right? So having Ag Canada scientists on the farm, helping us to understand the greenhouse gas impacts of various BMPs. You know, we're ultimately looking to influence the National Inventory Report. We need to generate better science for how agriculture is contributing or not contributing, you know, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, because those contributions are clearly going with the government of Canada out to Paris in 2030 to help meet the targets. So what to watch for? Sorry, this is the last slide. Funding programs. Funding. Hundreds of millions of dollars are flowing out for greenhouse gas mitigation and carbon sequestration, and a lot of it is focused on agriculture. So we need to be ready for this deluge that's coming. It's already starting to hit us. We're going to need people, we're going to need resources, we're going to need collaboration, and we're going to have to act quickly. So those are things to look for. Again, that increased focus on agriculture, significant increases in nitrous oxide coming from the ag sector due to increased nitrogen fertilizer use over the last decade. Significant, right? We've seen it in our corn, we've seen it in our canola. We're pushing 140 on canola, 180 on, and that's units of N on corn. If we're not managing our residual fall nitrogen well, we're getting nitrous oxide, and that's showing up in spades. Methane is the next one. Global commitments to methane reduction. The original text really focused on the oil and gas sector, but as that narrative was reviewed, agriculture became increasingly a much more prominent part of that methane strategy globally. So they're coming and looking at the farm and saying, what can we do here? You know, we've got options, good feeding systems, biogas reactors on manure. You know, we do have options. So I'm just saying, be ready for when they come. The adaptation piece is critical. We need to be looking at our risk management, vehicles, crop insurance, and others, making sure that we are risk proofing ourselves to the variable climate weather patterns that we're likely to see. The next policy framework, I've mentioned that numerous times. You need to keep a hard eye on that one and what that means for policies and programs. And look for researchers at your door. This living labs model means that we are going to do research at commercial scale. And if we're going to do it at commercial scale, it means we're going to have to do working together. And then better science and policy integration. You know, by working directly with the grower on delivering science, it allows us to better integrate that science and policy as we move forward. And that's the goal, so that we can drive BMB adoption. That's all I got.